When the Plaszow concentration camp was liberated, the horrors committed under Amon's orders came to light. Göth, an SS officer whose cruelty seemed to know no bounds. He fired from the balcony of his villa for pure amusement, beat prisoners to death, and punished entire groups for the fault of a single one. But what few know is that even the SS itself ended up accusing him of corruption, theft of confiscated property, and abuse of power. He was arrested in 1944 by the same organization that had elevated him, though not for humanity, but for having violated Nazi law by appropriating property that belonged to the Reich. Amon Göth was captured, tried for crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death for the murder of more than 10,000 people. His trial in Krakow exposed long-buried horrors: arbitrary executions, collective punishment, corruption, and the use of terror as a tool of control. He was hanged on September 13, 1946, not far from the place where he had sown fear. His last words were reportedly, "Heil Hitler." Thus ended the life of one of the Nazi regime's most feared executioners. How to create a monster, the social frustration in Vienna, that turned Göth into a National Socialist born on December 11, 1908 in Vienna. Amon Leopold Göth was born in a city still resonating with the echoes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was the only child in a wealthy upper-middle-class family. His father, Amon Göth, ran a well-established publishing house, while his mother, Berta Schwentner, took care of the home. Both were fervent Catholics, but even more so fervent nationalists. At home, order, discipline, and duty were unquestionable values. However, the context did not favor the upbringing of the Göth family. Vienna, following the Empire's defeat in the First World War, was plunged into instability, which led to poverty, unemployment, and the national humiliation following the Treaty of Saint-Germain, penetrating the collective psyche of young Austrians. Slowly, this created a breeding ground for the emergence of resentment, ultranationalism, and extreme ideologies. From his youth, Amon displayed a withdrawn, yet haughty and proud personality. He was not particularly brilliant at school, nor especially sociable. However, he possessed a steely determination, an iron will that would soon find direction in radical politics. In his adolescence, Göth was drawn to German nationalism and the anti-Semitic movements that were proliferating in interwar Vienna. Because of this, in 1925, at just 17 years old, he joined a nationalist paramilitary organization, the Heimwehr, a right-wing Austrian militia. There, young Göth learned to handle weapons, to obey without question, and, above all, to hate. In those years, anti-Semitism was no longer just an idea in books or speeches, but a tangible practice on the streets. Conspiracies about alleged Jewish domination in commerce, the press, and politics were commonplace, and Göth absorbed these ideas with almost religious devotion. In 1930, when Austria was still formally a democratic republic, Amon Göth took the decisive step that would define his destiny. He joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler. Although the party was illegal in Austria, its connections to the Nazi movement in Germany were evident. Göth participated in clandestine activities, serving as a liaison and distributing propaganda. He was arrested several times by the Austrian police, but this, rather than discouraging him, only increased his ideological fervor. In 1931, he joined the SS, the feared Schutzstaffel, the elite of the Nazi movement, which at that time was still a paramilitary organization that functioned as Hitler's armed wing or bodyguard. His membership number 43,673 is an archival fact, but it marked his definitive entry into the machinery of horror. Within the SS, Göth forged himself as an unscrupulous fanatic, willing to do anything for the cause of the Aryan race. Over the following years, his involvement in terrorist activities increased. He participated in attacks against infrastructure, organized sabotage, and collaborated in the smuggling of arms from Germany to Austria. In 1934, when the Nazis attempted a failed coup d'état in Austria, Göth was directly involved. He was persecuted by the authorities and, for a time, lived in hiding. Luck changed in 1938 with the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by the Third Reich, where the Nazis seized power without firing a shot, and former conspirators like Göth emerged from the shadows as heroes. He was promoted within the SS, rewarded for his loyalty and commitment. By then, Amon Göth was 30 years old. He had neither a civilian career nor a university education. His life was completely devoted to Nazi ideology, and anti-Semitism was his true home. His future lay in the ranks of the totalitarian power that was expanding from Berlin to Eastern Europe. His personal beliefs, a lethal mix of racial fanaticism, violent anti-Semitism, and personal ambition, were driving him toward the destiny he would soon assume, commandant of a concentration camp. Although he didn't yet know it, Göth was already walking inexorably toward Plaszow. The Dark Staircase, the rise of Amon Göth in the ranks of the Nazi Party. With the annexation of Austria to the Third Reich in 1938, Amon Göth ceased to be a clandestine conspirator and became an official of the new order. The machinery of National Socialism was now deployed with legitimacy, and those who had risked their lives for the movement were rewarded with power and authority. An active member of the party from 1930 and the SS from 1931, Göth rose rapidly through the ranks of Nazism. He was assigned to the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the SS Security Service, under the command of Reinhard Heydrich. The SD wasn't simply a secret police force. It was the ideological spearhead of the regime charged with identifying, monitoring, and annihilating enemies of the state. Göth found his natural space in this environment, a world where hatred and efficiency were commonplace, and where cruelty was rewarded with promotion. His work initially consisted of intelligence and surveillance tasks, but he quickly moved on to operating on the ground. In 1939, after the invasion of Poland, Göth was sent to the territories occupied by the Reich. There, the mission was clear: exterminate Polish resistance, deport the Jewish population, and establish German rule. In the Lublin district of eastern Poland, Göth began to rise to prominence as a liaison officer between the SD and the SS Totenkopfverbände, the units in charge of administering concentration camps. In this role, he became familiar with the procedures that would become the cogs in the machinery of the Holocaust: the deportation of Jews, the expropriation of material goods, works of art and ancient artifacts, and ultimately, the systematic murder and extermination became his new language. Göth learned fervently, observing his superiors, and this allowed him to adapt and excel quickly. It was there that he came into contact with Odilo. Globoknik, the SS chief in the district and one of the main architects of Operation Reinhard, the second stage of the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of Polish Jews, which followed Operation Action T4. Operation Reinhard, which lasted from 1942 to 1943, was responsible for the construction of the Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka extermination camps. More than 2 million people were murdered in gas chambers there, an early phase of the Holocaust. Göth not only witnessed but also participated in this machinery. He was entrusted with specific tasks such as coordinating deportations from the ghettos to the extermination camps, supervising executions, organizing the necessary supply lines, and ensuring efficient transportation. During these years, his name began to circulate as that of a ruthless officer, incorruptible in his loyalty to the Reich, but also with a marked taste for personal power and gratuitous violence. In 1942, he received one of his first large-scale assignments, to assist in the liquidation of the Lublin ghetto. Göth directed the operations with an iron fist, coordinating the arrest and transportation of thousands of Jews to the Belzec gas chambers. Those unfit for forced labor were shot in the streets in broad daylight. Contemporary reports highlight his efficiency and brutality. His rise within the SSS hierarchy seemed inevitable. The following year, in February 1943, he received his most important assignment. He was put in charge of overseeing a new forced labor camp outside Krakow in the Plaszow Hills. The objective was to transport prisoners from the Krakow ghetto there, which would be liquidated that same month. The task was daunting: build a camp, manage slave labor, and eliminate all resistance. Göth accepted the challenge with enthusiasm, seeing in this mission an opportunity not only to demonstrate his loyalty but also to consolidate his personal power. He was no longer a mere enforcer. He would now be a commander. The liquidation of the Krakow ghetto was his calling card. On March 13, 1943, Amon Göth spearheaded the operation that divided the prisoners into those fit for labor and those destined for extermination. Thousands were executed in the street or deported to Auschwitz. Those who survived were sent to Plaszow, a camp that was still under construction. Göth did not hesitate to conduct executions with his own hands. He became the face of terror for the Jews of Krakow. His figure, mounted on horseback in his black SS uniform, whipping prisoners and shooting anyone who moved out of formation, remained etched in the memories of survivors. In fact, it was there that he acquired his sinister personal pleasure, the one that distinguished him among other Nazi officers. He liked to execute prisoners with a random shot, without warning or justification, as in this way he managed to impose a permanent state of terror. With his arrival at the Plaszow camp, the young officer completed his metamorphosis, first from nationalist militant to terrorist, and then from terrorist to bureaucrat of death. His career was on the rise, but his humanity was fading in inverse proportion. In a short time, Göth transformed Plaszow from an improvised forced labor camp into a center of systematic extermination. Efficiency, obedience, and terror were his tools of control. He reported only to his superiors in the SS, who considered him a results-driven officer. The Plaszow camp expanded rapidly under his command. It went from housing a few thousand prisoners to more than 20,000 souls, including Jews, Poles, and Roma. Göth, in his villa built next to the camp, lived surrounded by luxury, confiscated from their victims. Every household item, every painting, every piece of cutlery was the spoils of a systematic policy of plunder. His power was almost absolute. He could kill a prisoner for arriving late, for looking a guard in the eye, or for collapsing from exhaustion while working, or simply because he felt like it at the moment, and he did. With his Mauser always at hand, he would shoot from the balcony of his house anyone who moved out of place. The figure of Amon Göth symbolizes the lethal union of ideology and opportunity. His rise within the Nazi Party and the SS was not that of a charismatic or brilliant man, but that of a useful fanatic willing to get his hands dirty where others looked the other way. In Plaszow, Göth became judge, executioner, and absolute master. His power knew no bounds. His decisions were law. Life and death were reduced to a wave of his hand. He was an effective cog in a genocidal system, but he was also more than that. He was a sadist, an opportunist, a man who found in Nazism not only an ideology, but an excuse to unleash his worst instincts. History has yet to reach its darkest point, because in Plaszow the worst was yet to begin. The hangman's days, Göth's brutal regime at the Plaszow concentration camp, Plaszow Hills, south of Krakow, on the ruins of two Jewish cemeteries, one of the Nazi regime's most infamous camps, would rise. The Plaszow labor camp was initially created as a temporary solution, a transit point, a place to concentrate Jews from the Krakow ghetto before their deportation to the extermination camps. But under the command of Amon Göth, quickly transformed into a self-contained hell. Construction of the camp began in December 1942 with the launch of Operation Reinhard, but its accelerated expansion came in March 1943, just after the ghetto's liquidation. The first prisoners arrived to the sound of gunfire and screams, many already wounded, others disoriented. What they found was not an organized structure, but a wasteland, barely fenced, where violence replaced any written order. The only law that existed was the commandant's rifle. Göth assumed command with complete authority that same month of March. He settled in a villa next to the camp from where he oversaw all movements. The house had belonged to a deported Jewish family, and their belongings, now looted, decorated the commander's new residence. The logic that prevailed in Plaszow was not just that of forced labor, it was that of terror. Amon Göth firmly believed that absolute fear was the best control mechanism. Therefore, he established a daily routine of arbitrary executions, exemplary punishments, and systematic violence. Every morning, the prisoners were lined up for hours in the open air. Any unusual movement, any suspicious glance was punished with immediate death. But that wasn't all, as death could arrive by any means, even if the prisoners behaved exemplarily. After breakfast, Göth would often go out onto the balcony of his villa, rifle in hand, and with all the time in the world, point his weapon at different prisoners in a perverse game of selection. Then he would shoot at random, men and women, justifying his actions with documents declaring that he considered them unproductive or simply inventing some arbitrary crime. However, inside the camp, he needed no excuses. His will was law. Göth's sinister game wasn't enough. The lives of those who survived the lethal routine were equally chilling. The barracks were inadequate and unsanitary. Overcrowded, poorly fed, infested with rats and fleas, the prisoners lived in inhumane conditions. The daily ration was barely enough to keep them on their feet. Many died of hunger, disease, or exhaustion. Others were simply executed as part of the daily spectacles of cruelty. Under his administration, Plaszow became a microcosm of Nazi horror. Although officially a labor camp, it also operated as an extermination center using slower but equally lethal means. Children, the elderly, and the sick were considered useless. Their fate was immediate: a bullet in the back of the head or a mass grave. Among the most feared were the kapos, prisoners designated as group leaders, who, to gain the protection of the SS, exercised even more ruthless brutality against their own inmates. Göth encouraged this dynamic, sowing distrust among the prisoners and fragmenting any possibility of organized resistance. Furthermore, the camp had a special team of SS women, including some infamous figures like Ruth Calder, Göth's own lover. These women were not mere spectators. They actively participated in the beatings, humiliation, and administration of terror. Sadism was shared, celebrated, institutionalized. Göth was not only a murderer, he was also corrupt. He used the camp as a personal source of wealth. He appropriated confiscated property, jewelry, and prisoners' belongings, and sold the expropriated goods on the black market. At Plaszow, looting and murder went hand in hand. One of the most terrifying episodes was the creation of the execution pits. On a hill known as Hujowa Górka, a name the prisoners humorously derived from a vulgar Polish word, trenches were dug where thousands of Jews were shot in groups. Göth would often watch these massacres in silence, smoking with his dog Ralph at his side, a Doberman Pinscher trained to attack prisoners with ferocity. Although Göth enjoyed these bloodbaths, he was not a brutal butcher. The executions were meticulous and careful, in his own way. The condemned men were forced to strip naked, kneel in front of the pits, and then were shot in the back of the head. The bodies were pushed into the pit and partially covered until the next batch. According to some Plaszow survivors, one could feel the earth shaking days after the shootings due to the movements of the still living bodies. However, Plaszow was not completely invisible. Some Germans in the area, ordinary citizens, knew or at least had heard rumors about what was happening there. They heard the gunshots, saw the columns of smoke, and knew that within those barbed wire fences, humanity was impossible. But fear, indifference, or complicity sealed their mouths. Even so, acts of bravery emerged within the camp. The most famous was that of German businessman Oskar Schindler, who, after coming into contact with Plaszow through business dealings related to slave labor, began protecting his Jewish workers, transferring them to his factory and eventually saving more than 1,000 lives. The relationship between Schindler and Göth was tense, ambiguous, but crucial for many survivors. While Göth sowed terror, Schindler in the shadows wove a web of survival, two opposing faces within the same system of death. The Nazi regime viewed Göth as an effective commander. Production figures increased, executions maintained order, and the camp was free of riots. But in 1944, something began to change. After the German defeat at Stalingrad and the Soviet advance westward, war crimes began to bother even the Nazi leadership. Göth was investigated by the SS main office for corruption, misappropriation of Reich property, and excessively cruel treatment of prisoners, a chilling irony coming from a regime that institutionalized extermination. Although he was never tried on these charges by the Third Reich due to the impending collapse of the war, his power began to decline. At the end of 1944, Plaszow was evacuated. Many prisoners were sent to Auschwitz, others were executed to leave no witnesses. Göth was arrested by the same SS in September of that year and sent to pre-trial detention. Ironically, the man who embodied absolute horror fell for stealing too much within a system that stole everything. The Plaszow camp was dismantled, the evidence destroyed, and the graves exhumed to burn the corpses, erase traces, and silence the dead. But the testimony of survivors, the images, the archives, and the collective memory would ensure that the horror was not forgotten. Amon Göth left behind a legacy of cruelty that still shocks the world. But justice awaited him, beyond the borders of the Reich, beyond the bars of his temporary prison cell. History now was headed to court. The edge of the Reich, the capture and trial of Amon by the SS Göth for his extreme brutality and corruption. The machinery of death that Amon Göth's leadership in Plaszow was not brought down by morale, but by military collapse. From 1944 onwards, the war took a sharp turn, irreversible against the Third Reich. The Soviet advance from the east, relentless and brutal, devoured German territory, and the cities of Greater Germany burned under Allied bombing. The victory Adolf Hitler had promised was turning into a prolonged agony. Within this spiral of chaos and disintegration, Amon Göth lost his power. He was no longer the all-powerful lord of the camp. He had been arrested by his own SS comrades. The Reich was accusing him not of his murders, nor of his brutality, but of stealing Jewish gold, jewels, and property that, according to Nazi protocol, belonged to the state. He had crossed an invisible line within the hierarchy of plunderers. Göth, the efficient killer, became an administrative problem. He was imprisoned in a prison in Bad Tölz, Bavaria. The black SS uniform, the emblems, the decorations, and the privileges were all left behind. His arrogance, however, remained intact. Amon Göth showed no remorse. In his statements, he continued to justify his actions as the duties of his office. According to him, terror was necessary to maintain order. Arbitrary executions were not crimes, but rather disciplinary measures. But the Reich could no longer protect its executioners. The Wehrmacht was retreating, the defenses were collapsing, and the Soviet encirclement was tightening. In April 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. With his death, the Nazi system imploded. German cities, reduced to ruins, fell under Allied control. And the men who had sustained the regime, one by one, were captured. Göth was still in prison when US forces arrived in the region. He was formally detained by the US Army, which already had information about his past in Krakow thanks to survivor testimonies, recovered documents, and the collaboration of the first Allied justice agencies. He was not just any prisoner. He was a high-profile target, a living symbol of Nazi horror. The Americans transferred him to a detention camp for SS officers. There, he was interrogated by Allied officers and members of the War Crimes Commission. During the interviews, his attitude was cynical. He referred to the Jewish prisoners as internal enemies and denied having ordered arbitrary executions. He claimed to have followed orders and exaggerated his organizational merits. In reality, he never admitted personal responsibility, despite the statements against him piling up on the desks of Allied prosecutors. The evidence was overwhelming. In Krakow, dozens of survivors, many of them saved by Oskar Schindler, offered precise testimony, names, dates, and details that left no room for doubt. Göth was directly responsible for hundreds of summary executions. He had personally shot men, women, and children. He had trained his dog to kill. He had turned Plaszów into an unofficial extermination camp where whim dictated death. In 1946, when the Nuremberg trials began, Göth, still in custody. He wasn't tried there, as his trial would have been conducted separately in Poland, the country where his crimes had been committed. The Polish government, rebuilt under Soviet occupation, had a particular interest in trying the perpetrators on its territory. The local justice system was preparing for an exemplary trial. Amon Göth was handed over to the Polish authorities in 1946. The scene was symbolic. The man who had ruled with an iron fist over thousands of lives, who had decided the existence of so many, was now led away in silence, handcuffed, humiliated. His arrogance had not yet been quenched, but his fate was sealed. During his imprisonment in Krakow, he awaited trial for months. Polish prosecutors gathered an overwhelming amount of evidence: camp records, statements from former SS men, reports from the resistance, and above all, the voices of survivors, women, men and children, now adults, who remembered every gesture, every shot, every look of contempt with surgical precision. The trial began in August 1946 before the Supreme National Court of Poland. The charges were clear and direct: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Göth was described as a cruel and sadistic murderer, directly responsible for the deaths of at least 8,000 people, although the actual number was likely much higher. During the trial, chilling details were revealed: the use of dogs to tear prisoners to pieces, the mass executions at Hujua, Gorka, the beatings to death, the collective punishments, the order to shoot children for crying too much. There was no room for ambiguity. The testimonies proved that the monstrosity at Plaszow was not a product of war, but of the personal will of its commander. But the trial itself would be a decisive event in the history of the Holocaust. The executioner's mirror, the trial, conviction and execution of Amon Göth, the executioner of Plaszow, September 1946. The city of Krakow, still scarred by the wounds of the occupation, was preparing for an event that condensed the horror of years of barbarism in a single face. Göth, the sinister former commandant of the Plaszow concentration camp, was to be tried for crimes against humanity. Not as part of a collective trial, but as an individual, as a symbol of an age of terror. This was no ordinary trial. It was a direct confrontation between truth and oblivion, between emerging justice and institutionalized crime. The Polish National Supreme Tribunal, created to try the main Nazi war criminals, was held in state. The evidence was abundant, the testimony compelling, and the documents irrefutable. But more beyond the documents, the German archives, the orders firmly signed by Göth, the most devastating thing was the presence of the witnesses, the survivors of the terror. Those who had once seen him from the watchtowers, or simply from the balcony of his house, pointing his Mauser rifle at them, while his German shepherd licked his lips at his side, savoring the blood that was about to flow. Göth's face was engraved in the collective memory of those who lived through Plaszow. It was not an abstract name, but a look through a rifle scope, a voice giving lascivious orders, a finger pointing to death. During the hearings, Göth appeared overweight and with a face hardened by prison. He wore civilian clothes with no trace of his uniformed past. He no longer had the authority of an executioner. Now he was a man alone, surrounded by judges, prosecutors, journalists, and victims. The charges were clear and specific. They accused him of mass murder of prisoners, systematic torture, enslavement of thousands of people, executions without trial, deliberate use of violence to spread terror, direct complicity in the extermination of the Krakow ghetto, and the transportation of Jews to Auschwitz. The lead prosecutor, Tadeusz Cyprian, presented a compelling case. He cited German reports, correspondence between Göth and his superiors, and the vivid testimony of survivors. The portrait that emerged was that of an efficient sadist, a man who had made murder not only an administrative routine but also a personal pleasure. Göth, for his part, attempted to adopt the stance of an obedient civil servant. He claimed to have only followed orders, never acting on his own initiative. He denied having personally killed prisoners and even claimed to have tried to maintain discipline under difficult circumstances. But his every word was contradicted by the devastating testimony. One of the most shocking witnesses was Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, one of the servants forced to work at his villa inside the camp. In a trembling but steady voice, she recounted how she had seen Göth shoot women and children from his balcony, how he ordered arbitrary punishments, and how he had trained his dogs to mutilate prisoners. Other witnesses described mass executions on Hujoa Hill, Gorka, where thousands were murdered in cold blood. Some saw him order the shooting of elderly people who couldn't keep up with the forced marches. The details were so precise, so numerous, that there was no room for doubt. The trial was public and widely covered by the Polish and international press. Poles saw in Göth not only a murderer of Jews, but also a brutal occupier who had sown terror in his own city. In the courtroom benches, Plaszow survivors sat alongside ordinary citizens, listening, weeping in silence, waiting for justice. When the time came to pronounce the verdict sentence, the atmosphere in the courtroom was dense. The court declared Amon Göth was found guilty on all counts, not for political reasons but based on overwhelming evidence. The sentence was clear and definitive: death by hanging. The verdict was met with a heavy silence. There was no applause or celebration, only a sense of closure, of minimal justice in an ocean of suffering that no conviction could reverse. The Polish government decided that the execution would be public, not as a spectacle of revenge, but as a pedagogical act, so that people would remember, so that the victims would see that impunity had not won. The courtyard of Montelupik prison in Krakow was chosen, the same building where so many prisoners had been tortured by the Gestapo and where Göth himself had sent hundreds to die. On September 13, 1946, the executioner mounted the scaffold with mechanical precision. Göth was led to the gallows. In his final moments, he showed no emotion. He asked no forgiveness. He did not address those present. He stared defiantly ahead and muttered a few words under his breath, the contents of which were never revealed. The trap sprang, the body fell, the rope did its work. A cameraman recorded the scene. The government ordered the footage to be preserved as evidence of justice. The images show a man who falls without honor, without glory, a symbol of evil reduced to human dust. The executioner of Plaszów was buried in an unmarked grave, far from the marbles and crosses he never bestowed upon his victims, but neither execution nor sentencing nor the oblivion of time could erase the horror that Göth had embodied. The Plaszow camp, demolished by the retreating Nazis, was reduced to a wasteland strewn with bones, and yet the trial served as an act of remembrance. With the hanging, the man's story ended, but not his legacy. Decades later, when the story seemed settled in the books, a new chapter would open from an unexpected direction: the daughter of Amon Göth, a woman who would grow up ignoring the shadow cast by her surname until she discovered that her father wasn't a war hero as she'd been told, but one of the worst criminals of the 20th century. And so, the story of the commander of Plaszow would take a new turn, no longer from the dark, but from the heart of a daughter searching for answers. The monster's family, the love affair between Göth and a Plaszow guard, and the search for the daughter they had together. Plaszow concentration camp, amidst barbed wire, screams and executions, stood a two-story villa with a garden. From its balcony, Amon Göth used to watch the countryside like a king from his throne, but that home, witness to so many horrors, he also harbored an intimate, murky and contradictory story, that of his love affair with Ruth Irene Calder. She was young, attractive and outgoing. She had worked as a beautician and occasional actress before meeting Göth. When their paths crossed, Ruth was captivated by his demeanor, his impeccable uniform, and his aura of power. For her, the commandant of Plaszow was a sophisticated, passionate, and influential man, a catch, as they used to say at the time. The Nazi uniform, which chilled the blood of so many, was for Ruth a symbol of security and prestige. It is unclear how exactly they met, but by 1943, Ruth was already living with Göth in the country villa. Their relationship was not secret. Visits from German officers to the home, dinners, and the smiling photographs they took of each other in the garden all attest to a seemingly normal domestic life just a few meters from extermination. For Ruth, that experience was almost cinematic. The war remained outside the walls of the home. Göth showered her with gifts, took her on walks around Krakow, and gave her access to luxuries impossible for most. She, for her part, cared for him with care. She looked after the house, decorated the rooms, ignored, or, as some historians point out, encouraged, what was happening a few meters away in the camp barracks. Survivor accounts agree on one disturbing fact. Ruth witnessed executions. She was present when Göth organized punishments and moved freely around the camp. Some report seeing her strolling among the starving prisoners in a fur coat. On one occasion, according to Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, Ruth laughed as her lover fired from the balcony. For many, that laughter remains etched in their memory as evidence of the utter disregard for human life she shared with Göth. But history has not been able to clarify whether she was an accomplice or a passive spectator to her lover's brutal crimes. Justice, at least, did not condemn her as it did Göth. However, it is recorded that Ruth never renounced that love. After the war, when Göth was captured, Ruth returned to Germany. She was pregnant. In November 1945, she gave birth to a daughter, Monika. The father, now in the hands of the Polish justice system, never knew his daughter. He was executed when Monika was barely 1 year old. Monika Göth was born in November 1945 in Bad Tölz in Bavaria. Her mother, Ruth Irene Calder, had been Göth's lover and lived with him in the villa in the Plaszow countryside, where he ran the Reign of Terror. Monika was born when her father was already in prison. She was barely a year old when he was executed. She never met him, never heard him speak, never saw him walk, and yet his presence would fill her entire existence. For years, Monika grew up with a distorted image of her father. Her mother, an elegant woman with refined manners, never spoke of the horror. On the contrary, he spoke of Amon as a great man, a patriot, or a tragic hero misunderstood by history. At home, there were photos of him in uniform, medals, and carefully stored mementos, all narrated from a place of affection and denial. Monika was raised on a lie that outweighed the truth. Her last name was an open wound. At school, when other children learned her name, they whispered and avoided contact, but the girl didn't understand why. Monika's mother was deeply loyal to Göth's memory and never renounced his past. Even after the trial, she defended him. For Ruth Calder, the Nuremberg and Krakow trials were a political farce. She never accepted blame. She denied the atrocities. She said the stories about Plaszow were exaggerations, Allied propaganda. When Monika asked about her father, her mother responded evasively. "Don't believe everything they say," she repeated. Monika remembered her always telling her, he did what he had to do. He was brave. But in post-war Germany, the truth couldn't be hidden forever. In the 1970s, when Monika was already a young adult, she began watching documentaries, reading books, and finding her last name in archives, photographs, and survivor testimonies. She discovered that her father wasn't just a Nazi officer. He was one of the most brutal concentration camp commandants, known as the executioner of Plaszow, a symbol of evil and synonymous with the systematic genocide of the Third Reich. The confrontation with reality was devastating for the girl. Monika fell into a deep emotional crisis. For years, she struggled with conflicting feelings: filial love for an absent figure, repulsion for his crimes, shame for carrying his blood. She felt guilt even though she knew she hadn't committed any crimes. The surname Göth was a heavy burden, and that's why she legally changed it. She didn't want her children to inherit that burden, but erasing the name wasn't enough. She wanted to understand her family's past. She wanted to meet those who had survived, to know firsthand what exactly her father had done, what kind of man he had truly been. That path led her, decades later, to an extraordinary decision: to meet Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, one of the slaves who worked as a servant in the village of Amon Göth during the worst years of the Plaszow camp. The encounter, captured in the 2006 documentary Inheritance, directed by James Moll, was as tense as it was deeply human. Monika humbly asked Helen to tell her everything. She wanted to hear the horror firsthand, not as punishment, but as an act of responsibility. At first, Helen didn't want to meet the daughter of the man who had terrorized her youth. She found it difficult to separate Göth from Monica, but she agreed, believing that perhaps this encounter would also help her close a cycle. She could speak for those who could no longer speak. The documentary showed the moment when the two women met in the same place where it all began. Göth's villa, still standing on the outskirts of Krakow from where he had shot hundreds of people during the mornings. Helen trembled and Monica wept. In that instant, they weren't victimizer and victim. They were two lives crossed by the same tragedy from opposite sides of the abyss. Monica listened without interrupting. Helen spoke of the terror of living under a man capable of killing out of boredom, of how she trained her dogs to attack prisoners, of how she shot from her balcony. She described the sound of the rifle, the feeling of constant fear, the bodies in the camp. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," Monica said. "I came to ask for the truth because I can't change the past, but I can live honestly." Helen, her face hardened by years and pain, hugged her, not as an easy reconciliation, but as an expression of humanity in the face of the unbearable. Monica's life changed with that encounter. She began giving talks in schools, telling her story, not as Göth's daughter, but as a woman who chose to confront the horror of her origins. Despite criticism, the rejection from some sectors in Germany who preferred silence, she became a figure who represented the fight for memory and truth. She said her story wasn't about forgiveness, but about responsibility. The children don't inherit guilt, but they do inherit the moral obligation not to remain silent. Monica Hertwig continues to live with the scars of a surname that marked the 20th century. His story doesn't redeem his father, it doesn't seek to erase his crimes, but it offers a powerful lesson. Even in the darkest shadows, there can be an act of conscience, of humility, of humanity. Amon's story, Göth, doesn't end with his hanging. It ends, perhaps, with his daughter's silent gesture of placing a stone in memory of the victims of Plaszow. Because in that gesture, though small and fragile, tremendously immense, is written a phrase that was never uttered at his trial. "What my father did was unforgivable, but I will not repeat his silence." Washed blood, Jennifer Tige, the mixed-race granddaughter of Amon Göth, would have hated it. At 38, Jennifer Tige, a black German, discovered that her grandfather was Amon Göth, commandant of the Plaszow concentration camp, and a figure who rose to fame as the villain in the film Schindler's List. Standing 6 feet 11 inches tall, biracial and German-speaking, Jennifer Tige was noticeably different from other students at Tel Aviv University in the early 1990s. Jennifer herself didn't yet know how different she really was. She would soon discover that she was the granddaughter of a Nazi mass murderer. Jennifer Tige's early years were tough and difficult. Her German mother, Monika Göth, became estranged from his Nigerian father when Jennifer was born in 1970. With difficulties, financially strapped and suffering from depression, Monica left her at the local Catholic orphanage when she was 1 month old. Monica and her mother, Ruth Irene Calder, visited occasionally, but showed little affection for the child. The visits tapered off when Jennifer was taken into foster care at age 3 and stopped altogether after her adoption at age 7. Her new parents refused to allow Monica, who was living in an abusive marriage, to ruin her life. Jennifer wouldn't see her mother again until she was 20. During that time, she grew up in a stable, middle-class home. It was a hard blow to know her biological mother rejected her, and she felt humiliated when other children questioned her skin color. But Jennifer was a survivor. Gifted with intelligence and a fighting spirit, along with the support of her family, she overcame her own depression in her early 20s and studied at the Sorbonne. Her time in Paris came to an unexpected end when an Israeli friend invited her to spend a vacation at his parents' house. In Israel, Jennifer surrounded herself with Jewish friends and loved every moment of her time there, so much so that she didn't want to leave, and she didn't. In what she called a twist of fate, she overslept the morning of her return and missed her plane. One thing led to another, and with an Israeli boyfriend in tow, she decided to stay in Israel. She spent the next 4 years at Tel Aviv University, where she earned a degree in Middle Eastern and African studies and became fluent in Hebrew. Of course, Jennifer was familiar with the history of the Holocaust and early 20th century Germany, but still he did not expect what was about to come into his life. Film Schindler's List was released in Israel. Jennifer went to see it with her friends and partner. She recalls, "It was shocking, horrifying, but I identified with her as a person, not as a German." Jennifer had no idea that the story's arch-nemesis, Amon Göth, the butcher of Plaszow, was related to her. Jennifer bore the surname of her adoptive parents and had no reason to suspect anything. Yet more than a decade later, Jennifer Teege was living a full and fulfilling life in Hamburg with a devoted husband, 2 young children, and a good job. At 38, while browsing through a large library in her hometown, fate led her to the truth unfolding before her eyes. Jennifer was drawn to a thin red book with a strange title, "I Have to Love My Father, Don't I?" Without knowing why, the book caught her attention. After flipping through its pages, Jennifer had the answer. The book had been co-written by the daughter of one of Nazi Germany's most infamous murderers, Amon Göth, the commandant of the Plaszow concentration camp, the villain from Schindler's List who had horrified her. Jennifer consulted the woman's biography at the back of the book, and her worst fears were confirmed. The author was her biological mother, Monika Hertwig, the Nazis' biological daughter, and the book was a personal journey to come to terms with this fact. Jennifer was shocked. Amon Göth was his grandfather, a grandfather who was a hideous monster. Later that day, German television aired a PBS documentary titled Inheritance, featuring Monika and Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, a Jewish maid subjected to Goethean barbarism. It was too much to process, and Jennifer's emotions shut down. She slipped back into the depression that had plagued her years before. Unable to face the world, her Jewish friends, and most of all herself, she saw only darkness. With the support of her family, Jennifer faced months of therapy and deep introspection before she was able to break free from her cocoon of anger, grief, and guilt. She decided to visit Plaszow, where her grandfather had caused the deaths of thousands of Jews. She visited Israel and spoke with Holocaust survivors. She visited her mother, from whom she had been estranged for so long, and heard the bitter truth about her grandmother, Ruth Irene Calder, who was Göth's mistress at his villa in Plaszow. She consistently denied Göth's wrongdoing until her final days. In 2013, as part of her healing process, Jennifer wrote a memoir chronicling her experience titled "My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me," referencing Amon Göth's possible reaction to a Nigerian woman. For Jennifer, responsibility is not the same as guilt. While she recognizes the gravity of her ancestors' actions, she has come to understand that she is not to blame for their sins. In her memoir, she says, "There is no Nazi gene. We can decide for ourselves who and what we want to be." The most famous Nazi in cinema, the legacy of Amon Göth in cinema and popular culture. The name of Amon Göth could have disappeared into the court files, reduced to a footnote on the long list of Nazi criminals, but that wasn't the case. Decades after his execution, his image resurfaced in popular culture, in history books, and especially in film. It was on the big screen that the face of the Plaszow executioner reached a new dimension, that of a universal symbol of evil. Everything changed in 1993. That year, Steven Spielberg released Schindler's List, a film that broke emotional and narrative barriers regarding the Holocaust. Based on true events, the film followed the story of Oskar Schindler, the German industrialist who saved more than 1,000 Jews during the war. But among the characters that inhabit the film, one stands out with disturbing intensity: Amon Göth. Masterfully played by Ralph Fiennes, Göth appears as the commander of the Plaszow camp, a cruel, unpredictable man who murders from the balcony of his villa as if choosing a target at random. The image is brutal, stylized, but faithful to the testimonies. His figure dominates the screen with a mixture of banality and sadism. He doesn't scream like a caricature. He doesn't hide behind hysteria. He's cold, methodical, humane in his dehumanization. Fiennes's performance was so powerful that Spielberg, by his own account, felt physically ill during some scenes. Critics agreed. It was one of the most disturbing portrayals of a Nazi criminal ever filmed. The character of Göth was not only recognized with an Oscar nomination, but also remained etched in the minds of millions of viewers. For many, it was the first time they heard the name Amon Göth. But for the Plaszow survivors, it was a painfully accurate reminder. Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, upon seeing the film, declared that watching Fiennes was like watching Göth come back to life. The physical resemblance, the mannerisms, the attitude, everything matched. Cinema didn't just revive the figure of Göth, it expanded it. It turned him into a symbol, but this symbolic power generated debate. Some historians and critics warned of the risk of aestheticizing horror, of turning monstrous figures into cinematic icons. Göth's evil, when portrayed by a charismatic actor, could provoke a dangerous fascination. Others, however, argued that portraying evil crudely was a way to raise awareness. Beyond cinema, Göth has been the subject of academic studies, essays, biographies, and documentaries. His story has been told from different perspectives, that of a war criminal, a Nazi official, and an everyday sadist. Some have interpreted him as the product of a system, others as a psychopath who found in Nazism the perfect justification for his impulses. In all cases, his figure serves as a mirror of an era in which the unthinkable became routine, and in which killing ceased to be the exception and became a method. Plaszow camp once stood. The grounds have been converted into a memorial. There are no reconstructions or ostentatious museums, just a hill with plaques, a sober monument, and scattered remnants of the horror. At the top, a granite figure commemorating the victims stands. No names, no lists. There is no mention of Göth, but his presence is felt in the void, in the echo, in the heavy silence that still envelops that place. The site does not seek to remember the criminal, it seeks to remember those who suffered. Göth's name remains a burden. There are no street squares or plaques commemorating him. His memory is taboo, but the case has been included in numerous educational materials about the Holocaust. German schools teach the story of Plaszow. The Krakow trial is analyzed. The dilemma of blind obedience and individual responsibility is discussed. In that sense, Göth becomes not a fallen hero, but a living warning. In Holocaust museums in Israel, the United States, and Europe, his name appears in photographs, documents, and videos. His story is intertwined with that of Oskar Schindler as his unredeemed counterpart. One saved lives, the other reveled in taking them. Two Germans, two life choices, two contrasting legacies. Göth's impact on the collective memory lies not only in his crimes, but in the contrast he represents. He is the face of what happens when power is wielded without humanity, when ideology justifies cruelty, when the individual renounces morality to obey the system. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it wears a uniform, signs papers, smiles at the camera. And when that happens, memory can't fall asleep. Today, in an era where extremist rhetoric is re-emerging, where denialism threatens the facts and history is trivialized, we must remember figures like Amon. Göth isn't morbid. It's necessary, not to worship him, but to avoid repeating the silence that made him possible.